All right, hello everyone. Today this video is going to be for factoring x squared plus bx plus c. This is the 5th lesson in Unit 3. So we're going to start off with this general idea for factoring. So it says we need two numbers that multiply together to be c and add together to be b. And, that is for the general form x squared plus bx plus c. So if you have a if you have a quadratic that looks like that, that's what you're looking for. Two numbers that multiply together to be the last term and add together to be your middle term. And so then when you find those two numbers, you create a factored version, which is x plus m times, in parentheses, x plus n. All right, so what does that mean? Okay, so we want two numbers that multiply together to be this number and add together to be this number. So then what you want to look for are factors of that last number. So for 16, I can get 16 by multiplying 1 times 16. I can get 16 by multiplying 2 times 8. And I can get 16 by multiplying 4 times 4. So if those are my factors, then I need to figure out which two numbers I can add together to get 10. So if I add 1 times 16, if I add 1 and 16 together, that's going to give me 17. 2 times 8 gives me 16. If I add those together, that's going to give me 10. And if I add 4 plus 4 together, that gives me 8. So I know that I want to look for, or I know that my answer is going to be found with those two factors, the 2 and the 8, because they add together to be 10. So then I fill in my general formula, which is like x plus a number. Oops, I don't know why that all moved around. X plus a number times x plus another number in parentheses. It has to be set up exactly like this with parentheses. If you just put a multiplication sign in between the two of them, then that won't be correct. So you have to put them in parentheses. And my two numbers are 2 and 8 because those are the numbers that multiply together to be 16 and add together to be 10. So moving on to our next example, this one's a little bit more complicated because I need two numbers that multiply together to be a positive 12 and add together to be a negative 8. So in order for that to happen, in order for them to multiply together to be a positive number, either they both have to be positive or they both have to be negative. Now if you add any two positive numbers together, it's going to give you something positive, right? So if you have like 2 plus 5, it's always going to give you a positive. And so I know that I need two negative numbers so that they can multiply together to be a positive and add together to be a negative. So I know that all of the factors that I look at should be negative. So that means I would want negative 1 times negative 12. That's a possibility. Negative 2 times negative 6, negative 3 times negative 4, and I think that those are all my possible factors. So then if I add them together, negative 1 plus negative 12 would give me negative 13 because you're starting off with a positive and then it gets more positive. Negative 2 plus negative 6 gives me negative 8. So actually I can stop working because that's the one that I'm looking for. I found two numbers that multiply together to be 12, negative 2 times negative 6, and add together to be negative 8. So since those are my two factors, oh, did I use the wrong variables on the last one? Yes, okay. So I said x because that's usually what it looks like, but it should be t. And my picture disappeared somewhere, but it was a t, so it should have been t plus 2 and t plus 8. Okay. So for this one, my variable is q. So this should be q minus 2, because I had a minus 2 for one of my numbers, and then q minus 6. And keep in mind, you can always check your work by multiplying this out using FOIL. So if I multiplied q times q, that gives me q squared. Q times minus 6 gives me minus 6q. negative 2q, and then finally plus 12 at the end. And when you multiply this out using FOIL, you should be able to work backwards and see, okay, well, what's going to end up happening is I'm going to end up adding these two terms together to get that negative 8. And when I multiplied the last two terms together, the negative 2 and the 6, that's how I get the plus 12. So it should make sense why we're looking for two numbers that multiply together to be your last term and add together to be your middle term. So the final answer should be this right here, q minus 2 in parentheses times q minus 6 in parentheses. So that is your final answer, but you can always double check it by using FOIL to make sure you end up with the same thing. All right, next one, w squared minus 7w minus 8. So this is where, once again, it's really important to know your multiplication rules with positives and negatives. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply together to be negative 8 and add together to be negative 7. So if two numbers multiply together to be a negative, that means that one of them has to be positive and one of them has to be negative. So then you're kind of looking at two sets of all of the same factors. So for example, 2 and 4, if I multiply those two together, it gives me 8. Oops. So I could have negative 2 times positive 4, or I could have positive 2 times negative 4. And both of those give me a product of negative 8. So sometimes you're going to have to check more than one version of the same two factors, especially when you have this negative at the end. So negative 2 times 4, 2 times negative 4, and then I think the only other two factors are negative 1 times 8, and just to keep it straight, 1 times negative 8. There we go. All right, so negative 2 times 4, if I add those two together, that gives me a positive 2. If I add these two together, that gives me a negative 2. Negative 1 times 8, if I add those two together, that gives me a positive 7. And finally, our last option, if I add 1 plus negative 8, that is going to give me negative 7, which is what I'm looking for, because that is my b value up here. So now that I know those two numbers, I'm going to set up my parentheses. I'm going to put my variable in, which this time it's a w. And then I just fill it in with the numbers and their corresponding signs. So I have a positive 1, so I have a w plus 1. And then I have a negative 8, so then my other factor is w minus 8. And once again, you can use FOIL, multiply it out, make sure that your answer is correct. All right, next one. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply together to be negative 8 again, and add together to be 2. So actually, I'm going to make this a little bit easier on us. I already found all the factors of negative 8 because they had to be positive and negative. So if I go back up here, I found that negative 2 times positive 4 does give me a sum. When I add those two numbers, I get a sum of 2. So those are going to be my numbers for this one. So that'll be really quick. So I have z minus 2 times z plus 4. And it doesn't actually matter what order the numbers are in. I think I probably tend to go with the smaller number than the bigger number, but it doesn't matter either way. Multiplication is commutative, which means order doesn't matter. So for this one, that one's going to be done because I already looked at all the factors of negative 8, and I just found the one that was 2, that had the sum of 2, more specifically. All right, last one, and I have the steps here. So if you want a little review there, you have to list factors of C, determine the factors, now have a sum of B, and then set it up with the parentheses. So this one is a little bit trickier because it's got a bigger C value. So we have negative 27. Again, this is going to be something that has a negative and a positive because they multiply together to be negative. But one way to decrease the amount of work that you have to do is by looking at this b value and then analyzing that as well. Because if I have two numbers, one of them is positive and one of them is negative, and they add together to be a positive number, so in this case, two numbers multiply together to be negative 27 and add together to be positive 6, if they add together to be a positive number, that means the bigger number has to be positive. So you can eliminate half of your factors that you have to write out, and just look at the ones where the bigger number is positive. So for example, 27 times negative 1 would be an example of this because I'm going to end up with a positive number because the bigger number is positive. And if I were to add 27 plus negative 1 together, that gives me a positive 26, which is not correct, but it does have the right sign. So we know we're on the right track. Let me think with a calculator. 27 divided by 6. Nope. It's not even. So I think 27 divided by 3 is the only other one. Yeah. So I can multiply 3 and 9 together to get 27. So I know that I need a positive 9 times a negative 3. Because the bigger number has to be positive, and when I add those two together, I do get a positive 6. So those are going to be my factors, the 9 and the minus 3. So then I set up my factors with two sets of parentheses. And my variable is r, so I'm going to put an r in both of those, and then I have a plus 9, r plus 9, and then I have an r minus 3, and those are my two factors. So once you get the pattern down, these aren't too difficult as long as you know your factors. Remember that you can always use Desmos to check to see if something is a factor. By the way, just a review of what a factor means. If you divide a number by its factor, you will get an integer. So for example, when I divided 27 divided by, what was it, 6? I get 4.5, and that is not an integer because it's not a counting number. So like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. It's not 0 or the negatives of the counting numbers. So like negative 1, negative 2. It has to be something that does not have a decimal. So that is why you only want to look at factors, things that divide evenly. You do not want any decimals in your factors because those aren't factors. So hopefully this clears up any confusion that you had. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to your teacher, and I hope this helps you with your lesson.